for the questions, I invite the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here. Yeah, I'm assuming, Laurel's the PM. Yeah, that's fine. You can have a minute.
Hi. I just rejoined. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Let me set my timer, and my time will start in 3, 2, 1. When second wave feminism saw success only in the developed world among rich and privileged women, the leader of that movement decided to move on as if everyone's life had already been uplifted, and the vast majority of women had still yet to receive basic legislation that improves their quality of life and represents their voices. We on OG believe that women in the vast majority of the developing world suffer more in silence due to the dominance of third wave feminism, and because of that, we are proud to propose. First piece of framing. First and second wave feminism were centralized movements, although admittedly absent from many parts of the conservative world towards common goals. The first wave focused on basic equal rights for women's well being, such as access to education, voting, better domestic protections, and financial empowerment. The second wave did a bit in terms of equalizing opportunities and treatment of women, with a narrative that women can be just as capable as men and therefore trusted with positions in the workplace and should be enabled to actualize their potential in that regard. What we regret on side government is that overly hasty adoption of third wave feminism in developed countries with the most privileged enclaves of women making this decision. We believe that the rise of third wave feminism in the 1990s happened before minority women, such as women of color and also less traditional women in more male dominated fields, received the benefit of equal enforcement of basic legislation that protects them. Discussions began to center around first world problems such as whether makeup or tradwife behaviors should be reclaimed and accepted before double standards for most women were discussed either. Basic stereotypes such as men being assertive as good, but women being assertive as bad makes them a bitch remained, such that there was an influx of women entering the workplace and yet being awfully discriminated and harassed because second wave feminism instituted the legislations and basic concepts but didn't ensure that everyone had accepted them there yet. As a result, not only were many women left behind, but even the slightest more privileged women didn't get the benefits promised to them while remaining safe at the same time. Comparatively, in a counterfactual world where third wave feminism was not implanted hastily and was not the dominant form of feminism, even in the world today, we believe that it is likely that feminist leaders in the first world would have checked their own privilege and would have been aware that the developing world exists and that they should try to trickle down basic legislations to the most vulnerable women before getting on to their more privileged problems. We prefer a likely world where privileged women also could have platformed less privileged women a bit more and heard about their concerns, which would have ensured that more women can crucial basic benefits before making an immediate transition to very liberal feminism. The first benefit we got on side government is intuitive. In the developed world, resources would have been less divided between political lobbying for equal application of benefits among women. In this world, society would have been willing to afford more social capital towards these basic legislations in the absence of third wave feminism, because the image of feminism would have been less radical than discussions were on legislations that were already accepted as far for privileged women. And extending that further to other women is a lot less radical than explaining third wave feminism theory to the broader public. The second benefit we get is a lot less pushback from moderates and people unwilling to accept change, which have plagued the feminist movement far more with third wave feminism compared to previous waves. Opposition cannot just say that conservatives will push back on either side, because reality in the 1990s is that many people were willing to accept that all women should have been treated equally, but were so indoctrinated by the patriarchy to accept gender norms that narratives that changed this were completely bizarre entirely. This is when the feminist movement seemed different than other social movements, as an effort to erode all traditional values, which receives pushbacks until this very day. We believe that not only do we get the most important legislation equally enforced among women of all different ethnicities and social classes, whether rich or poor, but we also make sure that social narratives are allowed to simmer and be accepted by people so that they would be more receptive to third wave feminism later on or in the future. In the developing world, since there is a lag time between when conservative countries listen to Western liberal countries, label feminism sorry. Since there is a lag time between when conservative countries listen to Western liberal media, third wave feminism is the first form of feminism that hit them. This is why conservative countries label feminism as a radical threat to their religion and completely oppose all internal feminist movements. In our world, the organic feminist movement that would have arisen inside the developing world would have been able to succeed at pushing first and second wave feminism legislations, because conservative governments can't say, hey, don't grant them those basic legislations, those traditions, and other conservative rhetoric we hear. Sorry. Because then they will. Uh, Sorry, because then they will turn into the West, where they disregard all of our traditions. Other conservative rhetoric we hear from Modi and other conservative leaders. We believe that the vast majority of the women who have suffered since the 1990s are from those developing countries, and at the very least, we protect them in our counterfactual because they would have been much less interference with their organic movements. Resources could also trickle down from the developed world much better in this world. I've already proven why we protect the most vulnerable women in the developed and developing world, and with that, we win this debate. Proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for the fine speech, and just a friendly reminder to offer and take POIs for the sake of engagement. I'd like to next invite the Leader of Opposition to open the case for opening opposition.
Hello, am I visible, audible?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'll start my speech on my next word. Third wave feminism isn't perfect, but it's certainly better than what came before it. We think that third wave feminism was the product of growing pushback against a form of feminism that shut out minorities and enforced a privileged white conception of feminism. And we're going to concede from the get-go that it didn't do so perfectly, but insofar as we see increased calls for intersectional discourse, increased women of color and LGBT women in visible positions of leadership, and a focus on feminist reforms in the developing world, we think these are generally positive changes that we want to keep, right? A brief piece of framing before I go on to sort of responding to OG and then explaining what our case is going to be. We think that the second wave feminism did a lot of things right? Like we segued from suffrage to equal rights. OG did a pretty good history lesson on this. The issue here, however, is that we think that second wave feminism was very much a product of the first vote. I think we agree on this, but I want to explain the structural reasons why. The first thing to note here is that the feminist movement was directly a product of the first vote because they were more liberal, they were more wealthy, and therefore, with more women seeping into the middle class, it reduced their dependency on men and therefore allowed them to engage in activism. Secondly, these people tended to be white because, like, the 60s was a time of racial prejudice. It was very hard for a black woman to get up into positions of leadership, especially when they also tended to be poorer as a result of racial discrimination. Thirdly, we think that the result of these two factors have therefore led to second wave feminism becoming a form of feminism that was very much about self-promotion and groupthink, right? We thought there were a lot of structures that were increasingly difficult to displace. And we don't think this is a matter of ideology, but more so general incentives, right? If you have rich white women at the top, they tend to promote the people that look like them. When they tend to be funding the very movements themselves, it also means that these are the type of people that remain in leadership and therefore influence policy and thinking, right? We therefore think that OG sort of identifies the problem but then fails to see the solution, right? Because we think that third wave feminism is an ideology, especially a dominant one, and its calls for inclusion and choice therefore create the moral impetus to undermine the structures of power within second wave feminism and therefore lead to more diversity. So we agree with OG that the problem is that the developed world is getting neglected, but the issue is that they fail to recognize that third wave feminism, as it was defined in the info slide, was the impetus for leading to these changes that therefore allow you to implement more changes across, like, for minority women, for women in the developing world, especially because then their voices were more likely to be heard, right? So we think it's a very odd counterfactual on their side when they suggest to you that second wave feminism is the one that shuts out the developing world, because it's exactly third wave feminism that, and its calls for diversity and more voices, that led to these women being platformed in the first place, that led to their struggles leading to the forefront. We think there are three positive impacts, therefore, to third wave feminism being dominant and therefore influencing the feminist movement. The first thing we note here is that we think there was more representation as a result of third wave feminism, right? Because of its calls for more diversity and more options and listening to more intersectional problems, that is the point at which we get more visible leaders from specific minorities, whether it be racial minorities or LGBT or from the LGBTQ community. What this means, therefore, is that we think at the very basic level, this is a win, especially for women from these communities, insofar as they are now able to see leaders who are able to represent them and, more importantly, look like them, and therefore they can relate to and feel heard within a movement that has traditionally been dominated by people who have also oppressed them in the past. But the second thing, of course, is that we think that this representation therefore also necessarily translates into representative policies. That's to say that the fact that you're now listening to black women or gay women means that you're now able to shatter groupthink and resolve blind spots that were previously present within second wave feminism, right? Because the whole point of intersectionality is that there are some issues that are completely unknown to you unless you are part of the intersecting groups of this privilege that therefore lead to specific incidences on your life, right? We think therefore that meant that third wave feminism was way more representative than second wave feminism, and therefore by definition appealed to greater subsections of the population who were previously neglected, right? The third thing to note here is that we think that because there were more options, because feminism was less cohesive per se, maybe that means you don't have a single unified movement anymore, but we think this loss of cohesion is good because it also undermines hierarchy and bureaucratic stunlock, right? Which is to say that now you no longer have to go through the traditional means, the mechanisms of approval, which were dominated by white rich feminists, and can therefore create your own splinter groups that were able to advocate for its own causes and therefore push for specific issues that were no longer in the limelight, right? And we think it's also this process of competition, the existence of other groups, that therefore meant that the mainstream feminist movement was also forced to change itself to appeal to these individuals because they knew they now needed to retain their support. So as a whole, we think that the third wave feminist movement as a whole and its dominance had therefore led to greater representation in the long run, insofar as it leads to more competition and more voices being heard. This resolves the issues faced by the most disprivileged individuals. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing.
Your whole argument contingent upon third wave feminism is good. However, in the counterfactual, we could also have third wave feminism. You need to defend the world where this is the dominant narrative.
Good to think that my argument is good. Insofar as you think it is good, then presumably more of it is even better. What I note here is that the reason why third wave feminism needs to be dominant, as I explained before, is because there were such rigid structures of power that dominated second wave feminism that required a stronger ideological push, one that was very motivated and very moral, to therefore displace these structures and lead to the positive changes that we are seeing today. The final thing I want to note here is on safe spaces and community. That is to say that we think that feminist issues were often very deeply tied with issues of class and race, and therefore when you had a single unified feminist movement, it was often very difficult for minorities to speak out because they felt uncomfortable sharing about their problems when they were faced with people who were more privileged than them in the exact same discussion areas, right? We think that the prominence of third wave feminism, the fact that now you have more decentralization, means you have more safe spaces where these people can talk about their problems and therefore resolve it. We think in general that's a good thing, right? Finally, we want to accept the trade-off. Even if it's the case that we're no longer able to focus on as many second wave goals, we have two responses to this. Number one, insofar as they were able to focus on the second wave, that also meant they had less of an ear to the ground when it came to minority issues, when it came to intersectional issues, meaning that even if you're able to achieve more second wave ideals, it often came at the expense of the most disprivileged individuals who deserve to have their issues heard. Secondly, even if it's true that you're able to push more second wave issues in the developing world, it is uncertain whether or not those things would actually lead to tangible changes on the ground, because the lack of receptiveness to the population, the unwillingness to hear diverse perspectives, meaning that the pushing of second wave goals may not necessarily be in the interest of the women who actually live on the ground and therefore have to experience the policies that are being passed, right? The final thing I want to do is talk about choice being inherently good, right? Because I think third wave feminism's promotion of choice was a necessary pushback to the second wave feminist ideology in which women were expected to be incredibly independent and no longer pursue other forms of valid choices in which they live their lives. I think this was a narrative that was very privileged and could only be performed by white women who were rich and therefore could live those super-powered lives, right? We think that the average individual who didn't have that level of privilege very much benefited from third wave feminism. Number one, no longer guilt tripping them about living those like perhaps more traditional lives. But secondly, also ensured that feminism as a whole didn't treat women as a monolith and therefore gave them more options, therefore maximizing their agency and allowing them to live the lives that they wanted to. I think in general, that is also a good thing. Finally, I want to talk about radicalization, right? OG tells you that because of third wave feminism, there was greater pushback from like the developed world. The first thing I note here is that having more diversity and choice often meant that feminism could adapt to the needs of the developing world, therefore reducing the likelihood of pushback. But secondly, even if it is true, I think the way the info slide is constructed, it suggests to me that it is not the sort of radical pushback that we hear about the fourth wave. It is a form of reasonable feminism that was just more diverse. Insofar as that means that it could be portrayed by people as more radical, it is unclear to me whether or not that portrayal would change, because all these patriarchs would nevertheless want to portray feminism as evil so they could reinforce their power. I think OG has no delta.
Thank the LO for that fine speech.
Wave feminism started dominating discussions far too early when second wave feminism had not yet trickled down to all the people that deserve it. When white women started enjoying the rights and representation from second wave feminism, they called it a day and said, okay, let's try to reclaim being trad wives so that we can do that, go back to doing that as well. The reality is that if you actually listen to Laurel's speech, it's proven that society was not receptive to third wave feminism as a result of not fully distributing and letting simmer second wave feminism most of people. And therefore, there is more pushback even against third wave feminism nowadays. So even though, yes, the info slide says third wave feminism is about intersectionality and choice, one, many conservatives are now going to prominence, which are opposing third wave feminism and excluding religious minorities, especially Muslim women, especially poor women, from the narratives of feminism and trying to shut out Western feminism from certain countries as a whole. But more importantly, even the very implementation of intersectionality and choice that OO just brushes over as perfect nowadays has not happened. I want to ask a very important question here. Is it true that even though the feminist movement now claims to espouse intersectionality, that it actually does? Because notice that even though the info slide stipulates that the third wave feminism is about intersectionality, that the concentration of wealth and privilege amongst women who dominate the media is the same. It is still white women, it's still Western narratives that focus on their struggles. So even though, yes, you get a few more women of color in the Barbie movie, the actual discourse of how they represent the struggles of intersectional groups such as minorities is awful. That is why you have a third wave feminist trying to completely destroy religion and disrespect that, despite how intersectional minority women of color or women with certain religions would still hold certain traditional values important to them. This is a norm that and a demonization of lots of these forms of tradition that have understandably kept privileged women down, that are still overly discriminated against and exclusionary of people and minority women at the end of the day. I'll take CEO.
So the actual difference is third wave feminists think it's okay to wear hijab, whereas second wave feminists thinks it's always oppressive. Can you actually deal with the comparative that exists in this debate?
Sure, I'll deal with that comparative when I talk about the worst case. What I'd like to continue on then, now that I've answered that intersectionality is not actually better, I want to ask the question, as stated in that POI, if choice is actually better. Because notice that without intersectionality and representation of minorities, the only delta here is reclamation and therefore choice by extension. Third wave feminism tries to dispute whether it really is so bad to be a trad wife or whether we can actualize these things in a normal way. Notice how trying to reclaim these things before all women have benefited from second wave feminism's reform of beliefs and making sure that it's safe in all societies to introduce these ideas is in and of itself regrettable for third wave feminism to have done that already. What this means then is that, sure, in privileged spaces, it's fine to reclaim being a trad wife because, one, these are the types of trad wives who choose being trad wives after they have already unlearned their socialization and indoctrination of the patriarchy that tells them that they have to be a trad wife, and therefore it becomes a legitimate choice. But more importantly, this is an acting trad wife, but also a trad wife that is able to break out of the things that made being a trad wife be bad in the first place. For example, a trad wife might not work, they might be a housewife, but of course they will speak up when their husband tries to oppress them and they will not take that thing. Notice that the immediate jump to third wave feminism has made it so that minorities in developed countries who aren't privileged, and also most women outside the developed world, will ultimately hear this narrative, about trad wives, and themselves internalize it further, when in reality they don't have enough counter narratives that will make them open to the choice. So in the developed world, amongst privileged white women, it legitimizes them to be trad wives, which they probably could have done anyway, which means no delta. And yet you are reinforcing the very stereotypical norms when they get lost in translation to the developing world. Look at the point given by Laurel at PM that was completely ignored by opening up, of how the media and conservatives will ultimately try to weaponize third wave feminism against feminists. Not only are they weaponizing third wave feminism, but they're more likely to co-opt it in ways that legitimize and only focus on, oh, it's now legitimate and reclaimed to be a trad wife. It is empowering to be a trad wife. And therefore double down on the expectations of women to follow these types of norms without actually opening them up to the opposite, which is the reason why it's okay to be a trad wife is because you could have chosen otherwise, but you want it. I'll take a PY from Oo now.
Sure. So a lot of this sounds symmetric. On our side, you still have the evil media, you still have the evil white people, but at least you're hearing some like minorities.
Laurel preempted this too. She already talked about how, yes, the media is conservative, but if you allow second wave feminism to simmer with them, and you allow the focus of the developed world and feminists with resources to be, okay, instead of introducing new concepts to people, let's introduce this same concept to people, but recognize that, oh, yeah, second wave liberties are only given to privileged women, guys. We should give it to all women of color, all women, etc. This is not necessarily in-depth discussion of intersectionality, but it's trickling down what we know to be the most central, most important benefits to all of these women, to everyone. At the end of this discussion, at the very minimum, I've already proven to you, to no response from opening opposition, why the most vulnerable women still suffer more, regardless of the extraneous benefits that privileged women will get on OO, and supposed representation of minorities only hurts them given their lived realities. Until you have removed the indoctrination of women and outgroups, men themselves, that of the basic equality that exists in second wave feminism, no one will be receptive to third wave feminism. It'll just be more harmful to them. What I'd like to engage with now is the worst case, in the worst case, people don't go towards choice. We believe that certain choices that you expose to people are not more important than having the counter narratives against them, right? So at the worst case, we don't get to reclaim being a trad wife, but ultimately that's a decision that individuals can default to if they need it for security, or they can individually figure out. That is far worse than not ever exposing people to second wave feminism because of the time lag between developed countries and developing countries that is necessary to make women first understand that there is more to life than being a trad wife before they take the risk of stepping back into that.
I thank the DPM for that fine speech. I'd like to next invite the DLO.
Hi, can I check that I'm audible?
Yep, you are.
All right, thanks. I'll leave my camera off because my Wi-Fi is quite patchy. I'll be starting my speech at the next word. Opening government's main problem is that they don't actually have a counterfactual. I think Josh pointed this out in his POI, and they didn't actually sufficiently respond to it. Notice that, sure, we recognize that intersectionality might not be perfect on our side, and third wave feminism is not perfect. But at least it is better, as they concede, because we have more minority women speaking up and having their voices heard. And sure, maybe it is still mostly dominated by white middle class feminists. But that's fine because at least we have other people who are not white middle class feminists speaking up. Their only alternative is to continue to stick to the same second wave feminist ideals that are ultimately still controlled entirely by these white middle class feminists, which is the entire reason why third wave feminism exists in the first place, because other people felt they were alienated and excluded by this and had to come up with an alternative solution. This is very telling because notice when Josh pushed DPM on this, he said, oh, we're just going to let second wave feminism so-called simmer, but we're going to expand it to all sorts of groups and to ensure that all people from all diverse races and backgrounds are covered. which, if you listen to it closely, just sounds like number one, they're going to do nothing. And then when they try to say, oh, we're going to expand it to other groups and other races, that's just basically third wave feminism. I think it is really, really important to reframe what is going on here, which is basically that third wave feminism can encompass second wave feminism, but not the other way around. I will deal with OG's main push, which is basically this idea of an overly hasty adoption of third wave feminism in four responses. The first response is just to take back the framing of what third wave feminism actually looks like. Notice that we can continue to push for a lot of the second wave feminist things that they want to talk about, things that everyone can agree on, like workplace equality, things like domestic violence, issues such as rape. These are things which all feminists can agree on regardless of race and background. And these are things that people continue to push for. Notice how, even though we might have arguably progressed to like fourth wave feminism in, for instance, the Me Too movement, the reason why it was so successful at rallying all these people together is because it had very basic ideals, right? It was rallying around themes of like power imbalances, sexual assault that everyone could relate to, even though there were different contexts and different backgrounds. This is basically an evolution of third wave feminism. You can continue pushing for the same ideals that are common to all women throughout the planet, regardless of race and background, but you diversify these experiences and ensure that their voices are heard. This is a really important response because this means that third wave feminism, just because it's dominant, does not shut out second wave feminism. We can continue pushing for a lot of the things that they wanted to talk to. We can subsume all their benefits. But the only difference, the delta, as Josh has already proven to you in his substantive, which is basically untouched, is that because it is contextualized to these specific groups of people, they are able to buy into it more. They are able to be more convinced of it, and they're able to enact a lot more localized change that is actually going to benefit them. The second response is that third wave feminism is, in fact, important and necessary to iron out all these issues that they talk about. And this is contextualized to the developing countries that they wanted to focus on. Because notice that when they tell you that a lot of the laws, such as employment laws and rights, are already in place, the remaining issues are things that cannot be dealt with by second wave feminism. Because notice how the average white middle class woman probably already has it quite good because all the laws are already in place. The people who are being left out, which is the reason why third wave feminism has become so dominant and popular, are the, for instance, the black women who are forced to work jobs and don't have the luxury of saying that they want to go and work jobs. They're already working jobs in exploitative conditions and they need third wave feminism to represent them. It is these cultural issues, things such as police brutality or like over policing, or things like lack of social security or childcare, that need to be addressed at a localized level. These are not things that second wave feminism can push for because the so-called laws and rights are already in place. You need these cultural shifts that can only be achieved when you localize it and you allow people to express themselves in their specific cultures and feel like they can buy in to a specific version of feminism. Third response, just another piece of framing here. Just because it's dominant doesn't mean it's the only ideal throughout the world. So, for instance, if you look at the Middle East or countries that are more so called backward, like Syria, Iran, and Afghanistan, there are people that are also just pushing for very basic levels of feminism there, right? You're pushing for basic rights like suffrage rights, like the ability to go to school and education. The existence of third wave feminism does not preclude you from pushing for these second wave rights. If anything, it only just convinces you and contextualizes it to those specific instances, which is far better than some white woman in like a faraway land telling you that you have to do these things. Fourth, and this responds to the whole idea of how the right wing is going to hit back. First, I think we just want to note that the right wing is always going to hit back at feminism because they just don't like feminism. But second, and more importantly, it's harder to hit back at third wave feminism because it's harder to just characterize it as a product of the West. If you use the example that PM gives you of India and Modi, it's a lot harder for Modi to tell the Indian feminists in his country that they are just expounding Western radical ideology when it's contextualized to their issues. It's contextualized to things like police complicity and the caste system. At this point, when it's contextualized to these specific instances, that is when we get a lot more buy-in, and it's harder for politicians to simply dismiss it, which is what's going to happen on their side of the house. I'll take CG.
Do you think women with intersectionality will not be able to find a job or like having a say on feminism without the dominance of third wave feminism?
Well, okay, I didn't quite get that POI, so I'm just going to move on. Anyway, So I'm going to talk a little bit about impact here. Josh brings to you two main impacts. The first is that you get splinter groups, which means you have better representation. This looks like things like localized change. And the reason why we think localized change is the most important change in today's debate is because many of the issues that we are talking about, that we're looking at here, are best resolved through localized change. Things such as if you have a black majority suburban neighborhood, it is far more important to get representatives into mayoral or county level positions where they're able to have changes over like the policing system in the area. These local representative changes are the most important because it's far harder to achieve like widespread change on national level. Second, this whole thing about choice, right? The fact that we are just able to get more narratives out with third wave feminism means that it's far easier for people to opt into different narratives. They wanted to talk about women being pigeonholed into specific narratives. At the point at which we at least have third wave feminism, we give women more options to opt into different narratives. At least we give these women a choice. This is something that government does not afford them. The trade-off is, even if we bite the bullet that things are more localized, at least we have more enthusiastic like supporters of this. At least we have it more specialized and more contextualized to the specific like situations of these people from specific races or backgrounds. And because of this, we are able to achieve much more lasting change, and we allow people to feel included in the long term. For all these reasons, go with OO.
I thank the dealer for their fine speech. To start off, closing half, I call upon the member of Gov.
Just to check, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to talk to you about the counterfactual. I'm going to talk to you about the actual capacity to get this delta, and then I'm going to talk to you about the paradigm of choice feminism and why this is harmful. So let's start with the counterfactual. In the counterfactual, you probably do have some sort of dominant overarching narratives and a set of shared goals that you are working towards. There are some things that are considered always bad and some things that are considered always good. Some choices that women make that are always considered bad and some that are always considered good. As other movements grow in power, right, as you see more movements towards the liberation of, for example, Black people in the US, the voice of these groups grows within white feminism just as it grows within the society. So they are able to give their own opinions without needing to do this thing where you legitimize all diverse opinions within feminism. You just legitimize the ones as they get legitimized. This means that you do get feminism growing more intersectional as, like, in broader society, you get, like, this push for diversity. And I'm going to expand on this when I talk about choice feminism later. But the key thing to note here is there is an absolute standard. There is a thing you can point to and be like, that woman is doing a bad thing. The thing that this woman is doing is not feminist because you didn't need to legitimize every single choice women make. So that actually brings me, I'm going to start with my argument about choice feminism first. Note that this takes a higher burden than our opening. Our opening tells you that, like, feminism is now weaponized because it's a lot more diverse. We tell you that choice feminism is inherently bad in every situation where it's applied, even in developing contexts. So let's talk a little bit about, like, what is choice feminism and how did it grow out of third wave feminism. The emphasis of diversity in third wave feminism emphasized the fact that every choice women made was different and influenced by a different set of factors, which is true, but also that every choice was valid because you could never understand the experience of another woman. What this means is that it required people to validate every choice women make. Now, why are not all choices that women make valid? Three key reasons. One, you get indoctrination, and you get indoctrination that's left over from the past for two key reasons. One, media lags behind what you actually are currently doing in society. If you think most of the media comes out maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it's still media that actively gets consumed and actively does indoctrinate people. And two, the power structures are still invested in the patriarchy, even as, like, the societal attitudes change. Think about the way that, like, a lot of power structures still support Israel, even as societal attitudes towards it change. Power structures just tend to lag behind. There's an inherent lag here. Second, you have bad faith actors and grifters. When there is money to be made by espousing patriarchal views, there will always be women who take advantage of it. This means there are women who are just in it cynically, in bad faith, to try and espouse certain views in order to make money and make money off, like, these grifts. And third, there are other forms of discrimination that mean that, like, inherently some choices that women make in their own best interest harm other women, and so these choices aren't valid. at the moment which you make all opinions legitimate, in addition to like all of the other power structures, that means you necessarily legitimize more the voices of wealthy women. At the point which you implement these choice feminism, privileged women's choices, privileged women's opinions are prioritized over underprivileged women, because the additional power structures you overlay onto it means that they just naturally get more of a say. This is different to what our opening told you, because opening just told you that like this gets weaponized by the right. We tell you that even at the point where it's not weaponized, even when there are women who like believe themselves to be completely feminist, they still like make choices that actively harm other women. For example, there are lots of like deeply Christian women who are very anti-abortion because they're wealthy and maybe like can support another child if they had another child. But there are tons of women who need an abortion because they cannot financially support a child, because it's an immense financial harm for them to have another child. And so at that point where you legitimize all women's views, it's now legitimate for women to say they're anti-abortion, and you can't criticize it because every woman's choice is legitimate. Every woman's choice to do things like to participate in like sexist practices, for example, like sexualization of other women, is legitimate just because she's a woman. There is no nuance, there's no mechanism by which to criticize women, because you've removed the universal standard of things. You can say like this is always bad because you've validated everybody's opinion. What are the harms? One, you just choices made by women to harm other women becoming much more like common, right? You get women leveraging their identity as women to harm other women. Think of the TERF movement and the way that they leverage their identity as cis women who need to be protected to harm trans women while calling themselves feminists. This is just a massive harm that they have to buy on opposition. I'll then now move on to the capacity, but first I'll take the POI from opening.
So the point of choice feminism is that you are allowed to choose whatever you want, but you can't do things that restrict other women's choice. It seems to me like being anti-abortion would do that, so it wouldn't be supported by the third wave movement.
The idea of choice feminism is that every woman's individual choice is like equally valid, right? So obviously it means like women's choices to harm themselves are valid at the point which women do things like buy into incredibly patriarchal power structures. That also gets validated, and you can't criticize that woman's choice because it's her own choice. But at the point which they buy into these power structures, they necessarily support all of the harms that those power structures have towards other women. So like, yeah, I'm saying if you say it's okay for women to like buy into extremely religious Christian ideology that's super anti-abortion, even if they're not the ones stopping women from getting abortions, you can't criticize that because it's her freedom as a woman, her choice as a woman to do that. And so at that point, you do get people buying into these power structures that way you wouldn't have, and not being criticized when they would have been otherwise. Okay, finally, on the capacity to make this delta, the decentralization of movement means you get like far smaller groups of people. So that means like vulnerable groups of people stay in their little group of people, and there's a lack of cohesion because there's no shared goal or responsibility, because there's no shared ideology or shared idea of like how to advance women. Like obviously we all want lives for women to get better, but there is no agreement on how you go about this at all, which means you're not all pushing the same thing. What this means is you don't get the full force of the feminist movement behind like minority groups. You just get that minority group behind that minority group. Like for example, you get trans women fighting for trans women's rights, but you do not get the broader feminist movement fighting for trans women's rights. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, you lose solidarity, right? Because there's no longer this shared goal, because there's no longer this shared meaning of what it means to be a feminist. Everyone has their own conception of what it means to be a feminist. So there's like massive loss on solidarity. But two, there's a huge emphasis on individual identity and the idea that like as a non-trans woman, you could never understand the experience of a trans woman, and you don't understand like what they need. What does this mean? One, it means people feel uneducated, so they feel like they shouldn't intervene because they don't know what's happening. They feel like they shouldn't take action because they don't want to take action on behalf of this group, and because they don't want to take action that could be seen as harmful by this group. But two, they feel uninvested because it's not speaking to their identity because it's so different. So we actually flip this benefit to vulnerable people because you don't get like the force of the feminist movement standing behind all issues because there's no cohesive feminist movement. First and second wave were successful, particularly because women are not a real minority. They're like women are highly successful in a pursuit of feminism because they can leverage their huge part, their huge part of the population, right? At the point which you are no longer able to leverage that huge part of the population, this is the reason why third wave feminism was so unsuccessful in promoting its ideologies. This is the reason why it hasn't trickled down to the developing world, is because like privileged women just focused on advancing their own goals and there was no cohesion. Thank you.
I thank the member of Gulf for that fine speech. I'd like to next invite the member of Op.
Am I audible? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Garth's burden is not simply discharged by proving that there are some successes of second wave feminism that they would like to see replicated in the developing world. The question that Garth has to answer in this round is, if second wave feminism were to persist, what would that look like? Would it actually have reflected or replicated its success in the developing world using the brand of ideology and the strategies that second wave feminists often liked to take? What is missing in this debate is a much more granular characterization of what that particular brand of ideology had in terms of logic and what it necessarily implicated. And secondly, like what specific types of strategies feminists would be able to use to actually sustain sufficient political standing and political status within their society, such that they are able to forward the overall rights of women within their respective society. I want to point out a number of things in response first before moving into my extension about why buy-in is significantly better through choice feminism and like the third wave feminist strategy. But the first thing I want to point out is that CG says that our side inevitably leads to no criticism of women who sexualize themselves or who choose to abort a baby. This is what I'm about to say in response also constitutes an extension that outweighs opening opposition's contribution, because I think all kind of gets stuck in the mud here in being able to like illustrate what exactly that inclusion of women would look like and why it was so important that choice feminism existed, because they were very happy to debate in the abstract. What we want to point out here is that on our side, third wave feminists say it's okay to do both. You could abort a baby, you could choose to not abort a baby, you could choose to sexualize yourself, you could choose not to sexualize yourself, because your body is fundamentally your choice. But second wave feminism reduces the ability for a woman to keep a baby on their side, even if they wanted to keep the baby, because if they did keep the baby, they would be letting down all the other women in their society or are seen as not sufficiently empowered as a woman. And so they are always kind of like tied between that particular community versus like their familial obligations and like feminism and what it demands of them. Meaning to say that the barrier to entry into buying into that movement is infinitely higher on their side of the house in the specific context that they wanted to liberalize, i.e. in developing countries. But more importantly, we would say on our side, it's okay because Rihanna like can sing about being submissive in her song S&M, but also be considered feminist and empowered in representing female sexual pleasure as the core of the audience's attention, as opposed to being reduced to being something that is subservient in like this, or being subservient or being like represented as a prop for a man's pleasure, like when Pitbull raps off about something, right? Like we think it is obviously something that should be discussed. Female sexual pleasure on their side of the house can never be discussed in the ways that are like very, very, very empowering, because it's always about how, oh, the men will ogle at this. It's never about what that particular female is trying to do for other women and what they are trying to do for themselves. It is obviously something that results in a world in which female sexual pleasure is just never really being discussed because it's too much like a man. They are behaving too much like a man. You're looking like you are like a sex-crazed maniac in the way that a man is, or you're looking like you're someone that's trying to objectify themselves to make money off men, so you're a gold digger. All of those sorts of misogynistic narratives persist in that particular type of world, which alienates some of the most powerful women at the time. So 1990s, who are the kinds of women who were sexualizing themselves? We're talking about Madonna. We're talking about these sorts of like real pop icons, like who are essentially already a big part of representing not just women, but also the queer movement. So for that reason, we would say that it is far better in our world when we actually have those kinds of women, powerful women, being able to explore sexuality in ways that obviously make female sexuality the center point of the audience's attention and imagination, which pushes the envelope beyond just seeing women as just like mothers in the household, but being seen as sex icons. That's great. Getting them worship, being able to reclaim. Like this is why like OG's like reclamation argument is kind of weirdly like roundabout, right? Because I think the ability for you to reclaim certain things like your ability to express yourself sexually, the ability for you to find being a traditional wife actually an empowering experience can only come when you are able to convince the rest of the more conservative women who are traditional wives to actually say, yes, actually I am a traditional wife and also a woman. On our side of the house, Malala Yousafzai can say, I believe in education. I believe in women's rights to be educated, but I also believe in Allah. I believe in Islam. I believe in wearing the hijab, and that still makes me a feminist. On their side of the house, Malala will always be forced to pick her choice. And more importantly, you wouldn't, on their side, have Malala Yousafzai at all, because these sorts of women will always be taught to stay silent, and they would never be seen as feminist enough, or they would be criticized in their world for wearing the hijab as soon as they gave their first interview about what they believed about human rights. Before I move on, OG.
We would trade off privileged women like Malala right now, immediately legitimizing this diversity of opinion, if we avoid pushback and worse treatment of broader women, and we include conservative women by first allowing second wave feminism to simmer.
Bro, Malala is a conservative woman, as a matter of fact. Secondly, she's not privileged. Her father literally teaches in a village school. Then she got shot by the Taliban. What world are you living in if you think Malala Yousafzai is like the privileged Pakistani woman? Like, just not true, right? Like, clearly not true. More importantly, we would suggest you by 1990s, education was more accessible for women in the developing world because of structural incentives within countries like China, India, and the decolonized world to actually untap the productive workforce and stimulate local demand by having an increase in the total per capita income, by having women actually go to work and pay taxes, right? So there was significant incentive anyway structurally for them to untap women as from like the household and obviously get them into education. We're not saying that education was not the biggest problem, right? But the biggest problem, we're saying that education wasn't the biggest obstacle. We're saying that the biggest obstacle was the buy-in, which obviously would have failed on their side of the house. For the extension that I'm going into, like the extension here also was already discussed earlier on. But by the 1990s, the reason why women's rights were stagnating in the developing countries was because of that sustained support in political leadership. If second wave feminism remained dominant, you would see like the radical feminism that would eventuate, which happened towards the end of second wave feminism, the type that was obsessed over the biological evils of men, their propensity to be power hungry and all that. The intersectional focus meant that the existence of trans women and non-gender conforming men was plausible because they weren't simply dismissed as not qualifying enough as a victim of the patriarchy, because they were inherent wielders of this biological power in the lived experience of being a man. And all that exclusionary rhetoric would increase in their work infinitely to the direct exclusion of non-conforming men or to like women who were like trans. That was the reason why at the end of this round, you had to believe that the most vulnerable were better protected and their rights were better advanced by third wave feminism.
I thank the MO for that fine speech. I'd like to next invite the Gov Whip to summarize the Gov Bench.
I just want to make sure I'm audible and visible.
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Cool. I prefer POI in the chat, so just type your POI. My speech will start 3, 2, 1. I think the reason why opposition bench is losing this debate is because they're not actually taking their real burden in the debate. That is to say, the counterfactual does not mean that there is no thought-driven feminism. I think the factual looks like, for example, there will be thought-driven feminism, but then there will be like some opinion from like second wave of feminism, which means that people can facilitate and actually promotes like more fruitful debate on like different opinions, etc. And that basically means that all the benefits that what opening opposition tries to talk about is not unique within itself. That is to say, for example, minority people more likely going to get promoted because of like thought-driven feminism is still likely going to exist and under the comparison. But there are like just two structural reasons why this is likely going to be true. I think the first thing to note here is just like thought-driven feminism become dominant is not because like their ideology is more appealing. It's more because like the position, the social position of like a lot of people coming from marginal background and their social position increases as a whole. That looks at, for example, because there is more labor shortage because of aging population, there's more women being able to take education, more likely going to have like a more important role in corporation, etc. And that means that it's not like feminism that is driven and lifting off these people's status, but more because these people's status has already been lifted, and that leads to the dominance of thought with feminism as a whole. And just that basically destroy what open opposition trying to focus on. That is to say, there is no unique impact under that argument, regardless of that, the counterfactual, even result like the dominance of thought with feminism, these people's status is probably going to be the same either way. let's then deal with like the closing opposition's argument on like the choice. But note here, I think like this is quite derivative of this opening opposition's argument already. But secondly, I just want to point out here, in terms of choices, I think like choices, like they're trying to frame this debate as like really ideal. Like, you know, for example, people can voice out different opinions. Like you can support abortion, you can against abortion, but if people are not likely going to interact or like actually deny your choices, etc. I just don't think that's how actually plays in the reality. That sounds true on theory, on like, you know, the choice feminism, but actually in reality, there are like a lot of institutions behind that is weaponizing the way that thought of feminism are actually influencing people in the real life. That looks at, for example, political infrastructure behind that, more aptly going to use women who actually support banning abortion, saying that, oh, like these are the women who actually sat on us, these are the women who are actually pro-life, and that delegitimizes the voices of other women in the society. And note here, these are the more likely going to be the privileged women's voices. It's likely going to be amplified in the society as a whole, and denying the choices of women who are more likely coming from marginalized background. And if you care about people who coming from like intersectional background, then you ought to weigh that highly in this debate, and that's the reason why we should win this debate. But secondly, I also look at, for example, like corporations incentive more likely going to using women who are like to stay at home as like being a housewife and selling more products, etc. These are just things that is more likely going to continue the like the patriarchy in the society. At the time when women started to, you know, for example, objectifying themselves or like sexualizing themselves, these are the things that like the patriarchal society behind them can use that and further like the oppression on women as in general for like every single woman in the society, that justify and legitimize the way that men treating women as a whole, because you accept that as a feminist yourself, and that means that people losing their voices and people losing their legitimacy on challenging that. But why does things actually get better in the comparison? I think there's several things to note here. The first thing to note here is just like we have more ability for feminist movement as a whole to call out things that looks like, I think like there are just things that is absolutely right, that it looks like, for example, women should have the right to do abortion because it is your autonomy, because it is your body. That means that women under RSI has more ability to unite far more women to say, oh, this is actually the feminist doctrine. You should not say like, you know, you're a feminist or like at the time when you are against abortion. I think that's the reason why you have more political incentive to allocate to this united force under RSI. In comparison, they're more likely going to dilute these voices because people are feeling like, maybe I should not voice out because that is against the thought of feminism. Because like if I'm trying to object that I will be labeled as like anti-feminism as a whole, which means that under their side, people more actually going to be diluted. The social movement more actually going to be fractured in comparison, which means that there is less political incentive to allocate actually into like progressive ideology to increasing protection to women as a whole. In comparison, I think it is far more clear delta in this debate that people are able to unite together and having like far more political voices in comparison. But secondly, I also think just like if you believe like, you know, their opinion, for example, clothing opposition's case is true, i.e. like some misogynist ideology is going to be passing down and this is going to be harmful. I think there are two things to know. Maybe that is true, I'm willing to bear the burden, but then the problem here is just like it's not going to be so harmful as that they're trying to persuade to you. That is to say, maybe there will be people rejecting your idea, but then like you have a community behind you. That is to say, for example, if people are judging you on wearing Baraka, but then like, obviously there are a lot of religious women that is able to be like trying to back you up and saying that no, actually our choices and our like voices matter, because thought feminism still exists in the comparison, and that's exactly the reason why you have the community support. And that means that counterfactual looks that people can reject each other's idea and think that, oh no, that's not feminist, etc. But then I think there are just like the one that is more compelling, the one that is more actually going to be able to, you know, like win majority of people's minds, are more actually going to prevail eventually. That looks like, for example, abortion rights is more likely going to be absolutely supported by every single woman, but like versus like just like more likely going to be dominated by white privileged women in the comparison. But lastly, in things like this, it's just really controversial. For example, religious freedom. These are just things that you're likely going to have like, you know, half of the people support it, maybe half of the people against it. It's not going to cause like huge damage on like, you know, just devalidate your choice and preventing you from wearing burqa, etc. I think that's the reason why their case doesn't really manifest in that way. Lastly, in comparison with ourselves, with our opening, I think opening government in this debate is kind of like shallow in terms of they never actually try to prove to you what is the counterfactual going to be look like. We gave you structural reasons why at a time when choice, like when feminism becomes like a choice feminism, is more likely going to be used by a particular patriarchal stakeholder behind it. But secondly, I also tell you like why things are likely going to get better. I think number one, we're taking a higher burden comparing to opening government because they're only talking about like third wave feminism after like second feminism like about to finish like that period of time. We're just generally talking about like third wave feminism as a whole becomes so dominant, it's quite harmful to the society. But secondly, we also tell you under our side, we're the one that's giving you a concrete harm. That is to say, maybe they gave you like some analysis on like, oh, it becomes less radical and there will be more funding, but it's just like really speculative and they never actually give you a concrete reason why that is true. In comparison, we give you far more mechanisms to prove why our comparative is true and why we are more likely going to be able to represent a marginalized group of people, are likely going to helping them eventually. For all those reasons, we're so proud to propose.
Thank the government for that fine speech. To wrap up the debate entirely, I call upon the op-ed.
Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Okay. When second wave feminists tell me I am oppressing myself by wearing makeup or dressing in short skirts and things like that, I get really angry because this is just a refusal to acknowledge the context where I came from. For example, the fact that I lived in Pakistan, where it is pretty much illegal for me to wear a skirt. So when I do wear a skirt when I live in Australia, it is fundamentally an act of liberation. And obviously, a lot of people who live in these different contexts that, second wave feminists might not be understand because they're so Western minded and only care about what feminist and oppression looks like on their side, also get angry and alienated by the rhetoric that comes out from teams like, the closing government team. And so I think that third wave feminism needs to actually exist in a dominant form in order for women to be treated like individuals, in order for women to have their context acknowledged, in order for them to understand that men can also oppress you by not, allowing you to sexualize yourself. And it could be an act of liberation for women to sexualize themselves. That is the thing that closing government misses, and that's the thing that wins us the debate. But first, let me just start by explaining why our extension is so important compared to opening opposition. Opening opposition basically tells you that the good thing about third wave feminism is it allows for diverse people to become prominent and it gives representation. I think the problem with the opening opposition case is it's pretty abstract. They don't really explain why these people feel welcome just because they see someone like them at the forefront of the feminist movement. They don't explain the differences in how these leaders act and things like that actually results in more people buying into the feminist movement and those effects trickling down. I think what Joel does quite clearly is explains that third wave feminism allows people from developing world, for example, to be able to pick and choose their battles. For example, Malala does not have to uphold the entirety of Islam in Pakistan in order for her to advocate for girls to be able to go to school. I think that is a good thing because it is a way harder barrier of entry to the extent where these people explain that there's a time lag between Western countries and developing states and things like that, for them to get to the necessary conditions where religion becomes an irrelevant consideration, or the fact that a woman wears a hijab and things like that becomes an irrelevant consideration. And so I think choice feminism allows for women to be feminism can also include wearing a hijab. Then fight for women's rights in terms of education, which actualizes their second wave benefit that they care about. Or they can say that afterwards, after they get that, after they actualize that, maybe they can fight the battle on hijabs and things like that. And I think this is the most concrete thing in terms of actually explaining buy-in and changing the hearts of minds of individuals so they're not alienated, that gets us above our opening opposition, who are just quite abstract and vague in terms of their benefits. Now addressing the government, the bench teams. So what does OG say? OG's central claim is that choice feminism happened before second wave feminism trickled down to all women, and as a consequence, that is a problem. The thing is, it's unclear what their conception of second wave feminism is, for this to be their central debate-winning push. Because, as Joel explains, it is quite evident that in the developing world and things like that, there was a push towards putting women in schools as a consequence of things such as like wanting to maximize economic productivity. But if you don't believe that, there's also Western pushes, like Western economic influences, for example, the IMF, the World Bank, and things like that, who tend to condition loans based on having basic rights for women. You have things like America, who literally invaded Afghanistan on the midst of the Taliban, restricting women in ways that were viewed as severe and ways that were viewed as deeply oppressive. That necessarily means that there's lots of choices or like lots of forces that allow like for a base minimal of rights for women to exist across the majority of the debate. Obviously, there are exceptions. There's countries like Afghanistan where women cannot go to school, but even in Iran, women tend to be more educated than men, despite the fact that they wear the hijab, because the Iranian government thinks it's really important to have them in the workforce, to have them working in engineering and in STEM degrees and things like that. And so it's deeply unclear what specific second wave benefit they're pushing towards the developing world. And the thing that we would say is that this then makes third wave feminism even more important, because it is just important to recognize that Pakistan had a female prime minister in the 90s, Benazir Bhutto, but at the same time, Malala could not go to school in the 2000s without getting shot. That is precisely what third wave feminism exists, and it can apply the same dynamics within a developing world context. And so the problem with OG is they frame this as opposed to developed countries versus developing countries, as opposed to well-off women versus not well-off women. And this dynamic can symmetrically exist in developing countries. And we think in order for those benefits to trickle down, it will have to be recognized that maybe the richest women in Pakistan can go to school. Maybe they can become prime minister. Maybe they are treated as legitimate in context of political dynasties. But the average Pakistani woman cannot, because class is a problem that the feminist movement does not deal with. That is obviously something that exclusively exists in our side, because that is how intersectionality works. Before I move on, I'll let OG defend their case.
Iran, Afghanistan, and poorer women would have less domestic violence and more women who are educated if feminism was never seen as hostile and radical because of third wave feminism. You still cannot prove that choice of one person that will empower them will not harm others.
You're using the most extreme concepts. Like Iran had women wearing short skirts before the Islamic Revolution, which was because of American intervention into the country. The same dynamics apply in Afghanistan, and it's not because of the second wave feminism, but because of exogenous political reasons that these countries are so extreme. Most Muslim countries are not Iran or Afghanistan. Most Muslim countries allow for women to go to school, like Algeria, like Pakistan, like things like that. It's just the poorest women cannot access this, and that's what third wave feminism deals with. What does CG say? They say that something should always be considered bad and something should always be considered good. But the problem is it's a question of survival for a lot of women. They cannot, it's not useful to tell a woman who is a sex worker that she is evil because she has to work within the sex work industry in order for her to survive. They don't actually explain the alternatives for these women when you tell them that their choices are bad, when you tell them that it's bad that you sexualize yourself and things like that. They don't tell us what options they give these women. I think it's important that we tell these women that they're not evil, that they're making a valid choice in the context of their conditions, because it's often the case, and there's no alternative for these women. That's something that third wave feminism recognizes. The second thing is they say some women oppose abortion, and that's bad because you can't criticize them. But they also don't explain what the benefit of telling a deeply religious woman who thinks it is murder to kill a child that she is wrong and things like that. Obviously, now she has to pick between religion and feminism, and in the context of billions of people being religious, that means that you just don't get a lot of political capital to do things that are important within the feminist context. Like, in fact, the fact that we have a bigger tent, which allows for more women to identify as feminists, including the most privileged ones that Joel identifies, means that you get more donations that result in things just like actually being able to build domestic shelters and things like that. That mean that the poorest women who cannot escape their abusive husband and things like that now can, because Madonna is donating to feminist causes, because she's still viewed as a feminist icon as opposed to someone who is alienated and pushing back the rights of women. Lastly, on tips, this is an offshoot of second wave feminism, which declares that men are inherently evil by virtue of their socialization, which means that people are reluctant to accept trans people within the movement. We can cop the harm of people saying that trans women, we don't fully understand them, compared to them saying that they're evil as a consequence of patriarchal structures that make them evil as a consequence. I think that is something that we're happy to defend. For all of those reasons, never been tried for.
All right, I thank the output for that fine speech and everyone for a wonderful, wonderful debate. You can cross the floor, shake hands, and in the meantime, the panel will deliberate. Okay, thanks everyone for a wonderful round. You can tell by the length of the deliberation that it was very contentious. It was quite tight, and I'll be as clear as I can with regards to the closer comparisons. You're welcome to ask me questions, etc. At the end of the OA. So we were able to reach a consensus decision, with the verdict being as follows. We gave the first to opening opposition, the second to closing opposition, the third to closing government, and the fourth, unfortunately, to opening government. So again, that is OOC, OCG, and then OG, so opposition bench win. Again, I'll try my best to be clear with regards to where comparisons were the closest in the OA. The structure will be quite simple. I'll just go through the debate chronologically to explain how we viewed the debate, etc. Opening government enters the round with the major claim that the hasty adoption of third wave feminism, as opposed to the concept of third wave feminism itself, crowded out the ability of second wave feminism to fully take hold due to things like the dominance of white women who were already liberated in those contexts, pushing for third wave feminism, while other contexts such as the developing world or more conservative areas were not ready for that adoption, leading to radical imposition, causing pushback and opposition by organic feminist groups, overall leading to the delegitimization of the main women's issues or feminist issues in contexts where second wave feminism had not fully benefited them, in favor of more liberal contexts where third wave feminism was now becoming predominant. The first thing I want to do is comment on the opening government case in isolation and explain why it was difficult to place in the round before I bring in opening opposition's material against it. The first thing I want to note with regard to the opening government material is it is unclear why the comparative of second wave feminism would have manifested any differently, given the claims we hear already in opening government. They suggest that there are reasons to believe liberal conceptions of third wave feminism cause things like pushback and imposition against the development of organic feminist groups, but they do not explain in the counterfactual why second wave feminism would have been able to organically develop absent third wave feminism, or why there would not be similar levels of pushback against second wave feminism to the same extent, i.e., the absence of third wave feminism's hostility does not automatically equal the ability for second wave feminism to develop naturally in the comparative, and I needed more robust material in the opening government to believe how the conception of second wave feminism would have taken hold in the alternative world. Second, I do think that it is still unclear whether or not second wave feminism would have taken hold in the areas they suggest, i.e., the third wave feminism's imposition upon these contexts led to the inability of second wave feminism to take hold, but it is unclear why, absent of third wave feminism, there would have been structures or factors conducive to the ability for second wave feminism to liberate conservative women, to liberate trad wives, etc., given the absence of third wave feminism does not automatically mean the ability for second wave feminism to take place comparatively. Therefore, I think the material on opening government itself was just difficult to place in relation to the rest of the teams in the round. Even without that, I'll explain opening opposition and the material they provided to beat opening government. Opening opposition material suggests that the way third wave feminism happened historically challenged the exclusionary structures in second wave feminism, and therefore was the natural next step in the process of feminism. This led to things like platforming intersectional women and issues in order to open up safe spaces for minorities to vocalize their problems, as well as to potentially push for policy reform about particular issues that would not have been covered by second wave feminism, which led to things like second wave feminism being subsumed by third wave feminism, while also taking care of issues not covered by second wave feminism. The reason why I think opening opposition beats opening government, in particular on those interactions, is when they discuss the idea of choice and why it's able to be subsumed better in the comparative where third wave feminism exists. Opening opposition says we offer more choice to women to opt into because obviously the world in OO allows the emphasis of intersectionality and individual choice for women, as opposed to second wave feminism that focus primarily on more basic liberatory structures. OG suggests that women in the context where second wave feminism have not taken hold are not even aware of that choice, and therefore do not benefit from third wave feminism. And the example they gave here is perhaps being a trad wife in Denmark is now legitimized by third wave feminism as your choice as a woman. But in countries like in the global south, where the stereotype and default is to be a trad wife, women there do not know of any other alternative and do not know of any other option. The issue here is, given opening government doesn't explain why the existence of the other option for a woman in the global south to not become a trad wife exists, and even if it does exist, why she would opt into those choices, given these structures OG themselves suggest are more ingrained in these contexts, it's unclear why the existence of an alternative choice, even in the best case of opening government, is going to manifest in these women liberalizing or becoming more liberated in the ways they suggest. Therefore, opening opposition's argument about choice takes precedence because they suggest that in the context where it is possible for women to decide what narratives to opt into, they are more empowered to do so, given third wave feminism is the machinery that allows those choices to take hold and opt into. Therefore, as well, in the opening half, the debate can't be about the most vulnerable women that opening government suggests, given that OG doesn't explain how second wave feminism simmers enough in these contexts for them to realize the other choice exists or realize why the current default stereotypes of becoming a trad wife are ones they should remove from themselves in order to go for other choices. The second comparison in top half is to explain the other benefits of third wave feminism that OR argues for. Things like safe spaces being opened, things like policy reform being possible now that we have more intersectional issues being put to light, etc. I think are just unengaged with by opening government, given that opening government focuses on a very specific context where third wave feminism was not ready, but OO is also arguing in the context where third wave feminism was ready to be adopted, which I don't think opening government sufficiently explains in response or outweighs against. And given that in the context that OG themselves are fighting for, they don't explain why women are any more aware of a secondary choice, but in the context where third wave feminism could take hold and could offer benefit, OG doesn't respond, or just claims the majority of benefits of intersectionality across the board in relation to opening government. That's the opening half. Let's now bring in closing government. They bring two extensions. The first is an explanation of why choice feminism is invalid, and the second is an explanation on why third wave feminism has led to too many splinter groups in the feminist movement, given that the emphasis of individuality in third wave feminism is what led to things like me not fighting for trans women's rights because I myself am not trans, or me not wanting to fight on behalf of other groups that I do not personally find my identity in, etc. They suggest then the counterfactual would be feminists united under one singular shared goal, as opposed to defaulting to individualized conceptions of what they think feminism should look like. The first comment I want to make again on the CG case in isolation is it's unclear what the united banner of feminism would look like in the comparative or what the shared goal would be. I think the damaging concession in closing government as well is when they suggest that the power structures leading to choice feminism being invalid will still exist in their comparative, i.e., if the reason choice feminism is going to be a harm is because there are power structures such as white women being in power or such as bad faith women trying to egregiously espouse negative views, therefore undermining the choice of women will exist. It is also very likely that in the comparative of closing government, the united banner of feminism is going to look like being pro-life or is going to look like being pro-abortion if the same women that are against it in the comparative they suggest against opposition bench exist symmetrically on closing government as well. Meaning, if the harm against opposition bench is that individual groups fight for pro-life and pro-choice, the alternative world does not have people not fighting for pro-life anyway, and it's very likely that the shared goal of feminism will be dictated by the same women in power or the same privileged women who are the bad faith actors closing government suggests will exist on the opposition bench. And that's why it's difficult to conceptualize in closing government what a shared goal of feminism is going to look like or why the majority of women would want to opt into it if the women in power are the same bad actors they suggest. Let's now talk about the government bench as a result of that material. Closing government very narrowly beats opening government for two reasons. The first is that broadly, opening government explains already why choices can be invalid. So I don't think the first extension in closing government about why invalid choices exist is any more meaningful, given that opening government explains the reasons as to why choice can be invalid if it comes at the expense of another woman's choice already. However, secondly, I do think that CG answers the critical question at the end of opening government with regards to what happens not just when women's choices are legitimized in all instances, but when each individual choice is seen as equal to another and cannot be compatible on a consensus, i.e., opening government explains why the choice made by third wave feminism to legitimize being a trad wife can harm one group or the other exists. But closing government explains why even within particular contexts of feminism, the competing choices of women are what impedes the ability of women to form a united, cohesive narrative of what they should be fighting for. And even if closing government does not prove what that narrative in terms of cohesion and unity should look like, the active imposition of different choices in a competing dynamic is what impedes any possibility of unity happening, which I think is a more robust explanation than opening government as to why third wave feminism itself as a core concept, due to its intersectionality, will lead to a preclusion of feminist ideology on net than opening government. That's why closing government very narrowly beats out opening government, despite the similar premises of choice being the penultimate reason for feminism in the third wave to not be as productive. With regards to the short cross, the comparison in the short cross is a question of whether or not the individualized conceptions of feminism themselves are good, because closing government says it causes splinters, which prevents the feminist movement having the full force of women behind it, in response to opening opposition, who says that splintering off is good because it allows platforming minority women, platforming different issues, etc., and things like that. In order to believe closing government wins this clash, I would have to believe that the comparative has a world where the united banner of feminism is one that is better. But I think given that closing government doesn't explain what the united banner is going to fight for, opening opposition's material of individualized conceptions being better stands higher, because they explain that you don't need to be united under a single banner. You can have individual ideas of what you want to fight for as a feminist, because you are intersectional and you want your issues to be platformed. Secondly, OO suggests why there are some parts of the second wave feminist movement that cannot be covered by the third, that cannot, like, after you've already achieved some of the second wave benefits, there are some other issues that are not encompassed by the second wave, which can only be filled in when you have third wave feminism to empower women to speak up about intersectional issues like the experience of a Black woman in employment, etc., and things like that, which means that it's okay to have individualized concepts of feminism if it means you can platform those issues in the pursuit of feminism into the future. And given that closing government doesn't explain properly what a shared goal of feminism ought to look like, I believe OO that explains there can be many different goals in order for feminism to fully progress into the future. And that's why I think closing government could not beat opening opposition in the short cross. Last thing to bring in then is closing opposition. And the extension here is an explanation of how the onset of third wave feminism centered primarily around women's sexuality and women's bodily autonomy to challenge the conception of feminism in the second wave. So as opposed to the focal point of being anti-men or focusing on the ideas of being a biological woman in the second wave, it became a more inclusive movement by which you're able to empower not just women's bodies and women's sexuality, but include a lower barrier of entry for women who do not necessarily fit the stereotype of what it means to be a feminist to also now enter the movement. I want to first compare the opposition bench because I think this is the closest comparison in the round. The first thing to suggest is I don't think it's as derivative as what maybe the closing government had suggested in the round. I do think the material grounds the explanations as to how the historic nature of the third wave feminism came to light and how it allowed the decenterment of men and biological women and instead allowed the sentiment of women's individuality instead. The reason, however, it doesn't beat opening opposition is because the critical question in closing opposition in its entirety was whether there was a significant change in the ways women conceived of feminism as a result of the onset of third wave feminism, which I do think, while opening opposition does not ground to the similar extent as closing opposition, explains sufficiently. For example, OO already explains why there was in second wave feminism a precedence of minority women or women who do not fit the stereotype of being powerful women, white women, etc., feeling uncomfortable about speaking out about issues, etc., when white women took up the most space. And CO grounds this by saying that we are now empowering the movement and opening the barrier to allow like stereotypical women, like trans women, etc., to enter the movement. But the premise of allowing more women to speak up is the same. OO also says that we can platform different issues. CO grounds this by explaining how, for example, Malala cannot just pick a side, but this also use her identity as a Muslim woman to advocate for her issues that she feels are dear to her. But the premise of being able to platform different issues while not being subservient to the main idea of what feminist was before historically was established in opening opposition. So although the closing opposition explains the historical nuance of it, the premises of why women perceive feminism differently as a result of the third wave, I think were sufficiently established already in opening opposition, which I am unclear is weighed sufficiently higher in closing opposition, therefore. For those reasons, opening opposition still very narrowly beats closing opposition in the round. Let's talk about the long cross of CO and OG. Similar to the comparisons that I've talked about before, OG says that the choices made by well-off women in these contexts are still going to come at the cost of women who need it the most. So the premise here is still that we may empower some choices, but it's going to reinforce either gender stereotypes or harmful narratives that are going to impede the progress of other women. OG, again, does not prove how second wave feminism will fix that in any meaningful way, which is why CO explains in the response that the choices made by women in the developed context will not translate into the developing context, i.e., the harms of opening government will only materialize if, for some reason, a woman in the global south looks at a woman in Denmark being a trad wife and feels like they have no other way out and feels like the narrative of having to be a trad wife is any more reinforced than it already is. But given that there's no explanation as to why these particular gender stereotypes are any meaningfully different in the comparative or any worse entrenched just because of third wave feminism, CO's argument of how women in other contexts are able to choose choices that are beneficial to them takes precedence. Second, I think CO flips OG sufficiently to explain why the choices seen as illegitimate by second wave feminism are now legitimized through third wave feminism. I.e., if it's true that there has been a historical ideology of what it was like to be a feminist, given Prime Minister themselves concedes white women were the dominating force in these contexts, third wave feminism is what allows minority women like Malala to challenge those notions and actually establish that there have been different ideologies and concepts of what we can be feminists as. Meaning, if it's speculative in the long cross, what choices are going to be bad or not, and whether some women will be delegitimized or legitimized by choice, CO explains why the offering of autonomy itself is a good thing when we allow women to choose what's best for them in contexts where obviously those choices will be productive. The last theme in comparison then is the back half. CG explains in the comparison of the back half similarly that the individual conceptions of choice are just ones that will impede the progress of feminism, given that you cause too many splinter groups or you cause too many competing ideologies to take hold, meaning there's no shared goal and there's no shared unity in what you want to fight for as a feminist movement. I think CO similarly flips this when they suggest that CUG does not answer the question of what the unifying banner is going to be. And given that it's unclear what consensus is going to exist in CG with regards to what the feminist movement is going to fight for, I have to ask myself, where am I more likely going to get feminists engaged in what they believe to be good for themselves in the future? Given that CG explains and concedes that people will have individualized conceptions of feminism as a result of the third wave, I then have to ask whether those conceptions are good. And CO suggests why they are, because it's a good thing to have a competition of narratives where you no longer have to pick a side as to what you want to be as a feminist, but you're instead more autonomous in what you believe to be the best thing that you want to fight for, or you believe in the types of issues that you think are closest to you. So CG, insofar as they don't explain why we ought to always unite feminists, but CO explains why we ought to always allow feminists to have a choice in what they want to fight for, given that there are nuances and complexities in the decisions and the circumstances they're in. CO beats CG on their own grounds of individualized conceptions, not necessarily being the worst thing to feminism as what CG wants to explain. That was the verdict. I'm sorry it was a bit dragged out. I wanted to be comprehensive in the comparisons. If you have any questions on the verdict, I'm happy to answer questions now. If you want feedback, I'm on Messenger or Discord as well. Otherwise, good luck for round 4.